Swear that I will serve His Majesty
Swear that I will serve His Majesty
duly and faithfully,
duly and faithfully,
and to the best of my ability,
and to the best of my ability,
fulfill the responsibilities and trust granted to me.
fulfill the responsibilities and the trust granted to me.
David Robert Patrick Eby is the 37th Premier of British Columbia. On the 18th of November, he was sworn into office, and right out of the starting gate, he promised to be himself, an activist, someone who ignites change. He focused on issues like bolstering people's wallets.
We need to hit the ground running, so today, because of the strong financial position of government, I'm announcing 2 new cost of living credits for British Columbians.
He zeroed in on public safety.
We'll announce how we're going to go after the issue of public safety, and it's all about working together. It's about addressing the root causes of the public safety issue in our communities, issues of mental health, issues of addiction, people struggling, how police, how the justice system, how service providers, how emergency healthcare workers have to work together, and how the province can support that coordination to deliver public safety for British Columbians.
And healthcare, and housing, and climate change. Instigating societal change has been his way of being.
We've got to fight every day to deliver for British Columbians in ways that they can see and feel.
When he was the head of the BC Civil Liberties Association, he was busy advancing human rights and civil liberties through litigation, law reform, community-based legal advocacy, and public engagement, as well as education. In fact, he wrote the Arrest Handbook.
Here we go.
But wait, there's more. That's him on the guitar with the Band of Ladner. One of the band's songs is called Learning by Doing Stupid Things, which starts off saying, "You don't know all the things you know unless you did it wrong too. It's the things that I don't know yet that keep me awake at night." The questions Vaughn Palmer and I will be asking the Premier will pertain to what's keeping him awake at night now that he's the guy in charge. Housing, his economic strategy, public safety, mental health and addiction, healthcare and cancer care, the environment. Join me on Thursday, April 6th at Conversations Live, starting at 7 p.m.
Swear that I will serve His Majesty
Swear that I will serve His Majesty
duly and faithfully,
duly and faithfully,
and to the best of my ability,
and to the best of my ability,
fulfill the responsibilities and trust granted to me.
fulfill the responsibilities and the trust granted to me.
Welcome to Conversations Live, an evening with Premier David Eby. Tonight we come to you from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. Haichka. Tonight, Premier Eby has agreed to spend unscripted time with us as we dig into the pressing issues of the province. Rarely, if ever, has a premier been so bold and so brave to have deep discussions like this without conditions. Mr. Premier, thank you for this. Joining me tonight is also veteran Vancouver Sun columnist Vaughn Palmer, who, as you know, is watching and scrutinizing your every move. Now, just before we begin, I'm going to express my wholehearted gratitude to our sponsors who make this evening possible. Our presenting sponsor is Helijet, which has generously donated 2 round-trip tickets from Vancouver to Victoria, which includes a night stay at the Empress Hotel, for a lucky subscriber of Conversations Live. We'll draw a name from the subscription list next Wednesday and post that name of the lucky winner on social media. Our event sponsors are Stem Cell Technologies, Fortis BC, Landlord BC, Polygon, BD Development, the Port of Vancouver, the Digital Supercluster, Research Co., and our media partner is the Vancouver Sun. Our supporters are the Surrey Board of Trade and Canadian Beef. And I want to especially thank Apogee Public Relations And I have to give a big shout out to the Old Boy Productions crew, who are experts in live, online, and virtual event production, but are also now offering live video press conferences. One last thing for anyone who wishes to pose a question. Please go to Slido, which is already blowing up with questions. Go to slido.com, enter the password conversations, and send in your question. And that's whether you're online or here live in the audience. Sean, our Slido master, will be receiving your questions and bringing them forward, and they will help to inform, many of the topics that we're going to be covering tonight. To further set the stage, here's Mario Canseco of Research Co., who just conducted a poll about Premier David Eby for Conversations Live. Amy, can you please play that video?
Half of BC residents are satisfied with the way David Eby has handled his duties as head of government, while just under 3 in 10 are not and 1 in 5 are undecided. Eby's numbers are slightly higher among women than men. His rating also rises among both the youngest and oldest residents, but falls among those aged 35 to 54. So far, Eby has fulfilled the expectations of more than half of BC residents. Equal numbers of residents think he has done either better or worse than what they envisioned. On a regional basis, residents of northern BC and the Fraser Valley are more likely to outline that Eby has done better than they originally thought. 2 issues dominate when BC residents are asked about the main challenges that lie ahead. Just under 3 in 10 residents mention either housing or healthcare, while fewer are worried about financial matters, the environment, or safety. Since December, the number of BC residents who are concerned about housing has fallen by a double-digit margin. There are some generational differences when we take a deeper look at the issues. 2 in 5 BC residents aged 55 and over say healthcare is their main concern, while more than a third of those aged 35 to 54 are worried about housing. The youngest generation, which used to focus mostly on housing, is now almost evenly split. In spite of the fact that disapproval for Eby is low, there are some major challenges to deal with. More than half of BC residents think the housing situation has worsened in the last 6 months, and more than a third feel the same way about healthcare and finances. Fewer than 1 in 5 residents think these 3 issues are better now than last year. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from Research Co.
So, Mr. Premier, 140 days ago you were sworn in, and right out of the starting gate, you promised to be yourself, a person of action. During your swearing-in ceremony, you promised to bolster people's wallets and zero in on public safety. In fact, you started announcing new programs as you were being sworn in, and you've been making so many announcements since, we don't have time to list them all. The big ones are, of course, housing, healthcare, mental health, addiction, and homelessness, all of which we will be touching upon tonight, plus other suggestions from viewers. Now, just a little bit of history before we get to you. Before you were elected, you were the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association, an adjunct professor of law at UBC, president of the HIV/AIDS Legal Network, and served on the Vancouver Foundation's Health and Social Development Committee. An award-winning human rights lawyer who you were repeatedly recognized in local media as one of BC's most effective advocates, and you've appeared in all levels of court in BC. You were a legal advocate for the Pivot Legal Society. You're the author of several books and articles on legal rights. Are there no end to your talents? Your handbook on arrest rights is now in its 3rd printing with more than 10,000 copies in circulation. You played hockey as a goalie, and you also played baseball.
Big indeed.
Well, it's an impressive resume. You fought against animal abuse as a teen. You were student council president, you graduated from Dalhousie and then moved to BC, campaigned against the Olympics, and then you beat out Christy Clark for a seat in 2013. You had 2 ministerial portfolios, that of Attorney General and Minister of Housing, before your current posting as Premier. Now here's a fun little fact. You were also the leader of a band, the Band of Ladner. Amy, we have just a little clip of you here. Could you play that, please? There you are. Not working? Projector's not working. Yep. It's a really good video. One of the band's songs is called Learning by Doing Stupid Things. And one of the verses goes like this: you can't know all the things you know unless you did it wrong too. How true. It's the things I don't know yet that keep me awake at night. So, prophetic verse. Now that you are Premier, what's keeping you awake at night?
Stu, if I'd known how this would begin, maybe this interview might have been keeping me awake at night. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Vaughn. Thanks to the Sun for the opportunity and the sponsors for making it happen. I imagine it's the same issues that are keeping many British Columbians awake at night. The need to deliver on housing affordability, a truly wicked problem. The challenge of people just finding a decent place that they can afford to rent or get into the housing market, the challenge for seniors to have a place to retire with dignity in their community. Our healthcare system, our public healthcare system, making sure that it's sustainable, that we're supporting our healthcare workers, but that it's efficient, that it takes advantage of the advantages of modern technology. And I see stem cells, one of the sponsors here, that we're using cutting edge research here in BC to benefit our healthcare system, not just having it survive so that patients can survive, but that we're actually leading the way. Public safety, issues of public safety and homelessness and sort of visible street disorder in many communities in our province. And then, of course, as every premier should be, a strong, clean economy that works for all British Columbians. These are the issues that I committed to in my leadership campaign, and they're the ones that I'm thinking about all the time, both for my own family and certainly for all British Columbians.
Now, I know you've only been at it for 140 days, but how do you think you're doing in making progress on some of these big issues? You've made a lot of announcements, but getting into the details and seeing that change takes time.
Yeah, I think, for British Columbians, what I hope their takeaway is from my first 140 days is that I share their sense of urgency about these issues, that when I had a renters town hall a couple nights ago in Burnaby, and there was a woman who came up to me, a senior pillar of her community, works at a local school, volunteers. She said, "I can't believe this is happening to me. I got an eviction notice from my landlord for landlord use. I'm looking around for a place to live in the community that I've served for years, near the school where I work, and I can't find anything. And I'm going to have to move out of this community, and I just can't believe this is happening to me." And so, the urgency that I feel around addressing this issue for her, for so many people in the province, is driving this energy that you see from our government around getting these initiatives in place. We're not going to be able to solve all these problems between now and the next election, but I want British Columbians to see very clearly landmarks of where we're going. And I want them to see progress. I've said it a few times. Vaughn will cringe because he's heard it so many times, but I want people to see and feel and touch, be able to see these things in their community, see progress. So on healthcare, just a couple days ago, an historic agreement with the BC Nurses Union, where nurses are now working hand in hand with government on an innovative new staffing model, where we're aligned in delivering for our healthcare system, where they're getting the respect they deserve for holding up our healthcare system both through the pandemic and now. The deal with the family doctors, so that people can get a family doctor. We know that there are 300 more family doctors taking patients now in the province because of that deal. And so, we want people to be seeing other people getting family doctors. We want them to get family doctors. And we want, when they go to the hospital, when they're talking to nurses, when they're interacting with staff, to hear from them that things are improving, that we're headed in the right direction. So these are the goals I have for where we're going to be at the next election, and in the long term, that we're addressing these issues for British Columbians.
Now, you don't just get to get questions from me. Over to you, Vaughn. Your response to what you've just heard.
Well, thank you very much for doing this, Premier. You've indeed set a very, very ambitious agenda on some very difficult to solve problems, and it's your line, which we've heard many times. You're promising results, stuff that people can see and feel and hear and experience. Is it possible that you've raised expectations too high?
for myself and for my own feeling about having this job, and I just want to set up, I was supposed to be the lead singer of a very popular rock and roll band, and that did not work out. So this is my backup career. I didn't expect to be the Premier of British Columbia. I wasn't aiming to get that job. In fact, I went to law school to learn how to sue politicians because I didn't believe that politicians could be counted on to do the right thing. I thought they had to be corrected, set straight by external forces, including litigation. And so it's been a bit of a path, and maybe we'll get into it tonight, but to get to this place. But I feel like every day in this job is an opportunity to deliver for British Columbians on the issues that we care about together. And I've been working on housing issues for a long time. And this 16 months is a chance to do some big stuff, to move the needle on these issues and to make things better for people. And I keep getting asked by different political observers, they're like, this is the time to call an election. Like, your numbers are okay. Thanks, Mario. Thank goodness. They're like, we did a poll on you, and but this is the time. Your numbers are good. The economy's okay, but storm clouds are gathering. Like, we don't know what things are going to be like. You should call an election now. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is a window of time, a year and a few months, to really show British Columbians what the possibility is of government to make life better for people. Cynicism about politicians is at an all-time high, and I was in that group, believing that you could only get places by suing politicians. And so if we can show people, like in a limited way, we did with ICBC, turning it around, reducing rates, that government can do these things, it feels like, okay, well, maybe, I still don't like politicians, but, maybe there is a role for government to do things that support me and my family. There's a chance to show that to people. I would never pass it up, and I'm so excited about it. If I raise expectations and don't meet them in British Columbians at the end, say, what, you told us you were going to do things, you didn't get them done, I'm willing to take that chance. But the only way to get people together and unified and looking forward to what the province can be is by setting those expectations, saying this is where we're going, and we can only get there if we work together.
The people in the group that you used to be in, some of the activists,
Pivot
Legal Society, no. Although now you know why they asked a former rock critic to do the interview, right? The Pivot Legal Society, BC Civil Liberties Association activist, Angelia Padarai, when she ran for the party leadership, the line you hear from them is, "Oh, David Eby's become one of those politicians now. He's not standing up for what he used to stand for when he was with us. He's now the establishment." What's your reaction when you hear that?
I think that there is a critical role in the province for strong voices on human rights, on the environment, on looking after people who are on the edge. I think it's essential. I've been one of those voices. I strongly support it. And I also think there's an absolutely critical role for people to get involved in government, to get involved in governance, to participate in public bodies, trying to deliver some of those ideals in a very real way that makes a difference in community. And one of the things that, for myself, in those kinds of roles, I started getting tired of myself always being like, I disagree with that, I disagree with that, I disagree with that. And at a certain point, wanting to put forward, okay, well, what should we be doing? Where should we be going? What is possible? And then when you put those things forward, realizing that actually has to be put in a law, that has to actually be funded from the public purse, that actually has to involve a coalition of people to actually do that work. And it's government, it's companies, it's not-for-profits, it's labor, it's British Columbians doing that, but government is one of those vehicles that can really bring all of that together. And so they're right, I'm not that activist, but I still share those ideals about where our province can go, that every person can be treated with respect, that we can have economic development and a clean environment. We can deliver these things, but I'm in a different role now to bring people together to try to create a province where those ideals that we all share can be realized.
The big decision here in Vancouver, the big event in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, was the removal of the encampment on the downtown east side. Was that the right thing to do?
This is a really miserable situation. And we released our housing plan this week, and I imagine we're going to get to talking about it. But if there's anyone out there who's like, I don't think there is in British Columbia looking at the polling numbers, but if there's anyone out there who's like, the housing situation isn't as bad as people say it is, there's not a housing crisis, whatever, they should look at what happened in the downtown east side over the last couple of days. I'm sure people are seeing the encampments in their communities in different parts of the province, because I see them when I'm traveling around the province. I've seen them all the way down the west coast of the United States. And that is ground zero for the housing crisis. The specific situation of, I mean, the connection to the larger housing crisis, just to finish the thought, is, you know, people who earn a decent income, looking for a place to live, are now renting places that used to be rented by people with lower income and bidding up those rents. And then everyone's going down a level, bump, 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 and then people are falling out the bottom of the housing market. It's primarily people on fixed income, disability assistance, social assistance, and seniors. And so looking at housing as an ecosystem can help address some of what we're seeing in the streets. It's not the full solution, it's also mental health and addiction, but we can talk about that. For the downtown east side specifically, the Hastings corridor, we had a situation of fire and explosions made in Hastings and the tents. We had a fire last weekend where firefighters couldn't get to a fire that was in a rental building because they were blocked by obstructions on the sidewalk, tents, and structures. We almost lost another low-cost rental building. There was a survey by a nonprofit organization of 50 women who had been living in and around the encampment. 100%, 50 women reported being sexually assaulted in the encampment. Police were pulling guns and weapons out of the tents. And so there were two possible choices. One was leave the encampment there, hope we don't have a catastrophic fire where people actually die, people aren't murdered, that another building doesn't burn down because there's a fire in the tent and it goes to one of the buildings. Or what happened yesterday, which is to give people, again, there were many housing offers over the last few months. About 90 people have been moved inside from the encampment. But to say, look, we have emergency shelter, we can get you inside, but you can't stay here because it's not safe. It's not safe for the broader community. And so it was an incredibly difficult situation. It was unfortunately necessary, but it is the exact opposite of what we want to have happen. We want people to have dignified housing, and we're headed in that direction. 110 units a month, opening up to respond to the particular crisis in the downtown east side over the next 3 months. We have a building that just got its occupancy permit yesterday. People will be moving in the days to come. So those folks who took us up on the offer of the emergency shelter, they'll be connected with social workers and they'll be able to assess what kind of housing they can go into. Some of them will go into that new building. And so addressing this problem, you know, it's the best of a terrible bunch of choices, really.
You know, in an interview that I did with Douglas Todd a couple of months ago, he described the situation down on the downtown east side as a wicked problem, in the sense that you have one issue after another layered on top of one another. They're woven together, and you can't pull one out and say, oh, here, let's try this. And there's no proven model that anything works. How can we start to try and create a coordinated strategy that says we have to address multiple issues simultaneously? Do we have the resources and the ability to do that?
There are places around the world that have had downtown east side-like neighborhoods. People in crisis, sort of poly-crisis situation of mental health, addiction, poverty, intergenerational poverty. They have been able to transition those neighborhoods into healthy, low-income communities. I believe very strongly that coordinating the provincial government, the municipal government, the federal government, Indigenous leadership, service providers, and people from the neighborhood, that we can work together and we can address the issues of the downtown east side again, not overnight, but in a way that people will see progress and we can work together to make it a much healthier place. Right now, there is nobody bottom lining what happens in the downtown east side. So service providers and charities are in there trying to do their best. The health authorities in there trying to do their best. The federal government has little funding programs here and there. Nonprofits are trying to do their best. They get some funding from us, some funding from the feds. They do fundraisers. And the lack of coordination results in a lack of meaningful progress. And so we've pulled together 50, it's a lot, stakeholders from all those sectors that I talked about, where we have started that conversation about how we're going to create a plan to move the downtown east side from the state of crisis it's in into a healthy low-income community. It's going to involve things like getting rid of the single-room occupancy buildings, making sure there's actually livable accommodation for people in the downtown east side, coordinating between agencies and governments so that we're all funding in the same direction, not undermining each other's initiatives, not duplicating them. And that coordination will make a significant difference on its own, but using the authorities of the provincial government with the support of the city to really address some of these issues. And we'll take that leadership role. We have to get through this immediate crisis, though, of the encampments to really get into that work.
So when former Mayor Gregor Robertson was first elected, he was going to wrestle homelessness to the ground, and there would be none of it by the time that he had finished his term as mayor. People just keep coming, and they keep coming, and the magnitude of the problem keeps growing. Can we ever stay ahead of it?
So our housing plan that was released a few days ago now, the theme of it is more homes faster, and the reason for it is exactly what's behind your question, is we need to build a lot more housing, and in particular we need to build a lot more housing for people who actually have a decent income. You know, they're the nurses, the teachers, the reporters. No offense. The small business owners, the people who work in the coffee shop. There are people, and there's a range of these middle-income folks, sort of from the service industry level to, I've talked to people who have really decent jobs and earn a good income, and they say, like, we can't find anywhere to live. And so building homes for that group of people is something the provincial government has not done before on a large scale, and that is something we're trying to do through policy now, through our announcement that we're going to allow for the same process that you use to build a single-family home, you could build a duplex or a triplex or a townhome, and that will allow more of this gentle density, more housing options for people, and for many neighborhoods, the voice of kids again in the street, that there are kids in the playground, that there are workers, that there's a nurse in the hospital, that there's a teacher at the school that actually lives in the neighborhood, that there's a childcare worker that actually lives across the street. So these are the goals that we have. It's one part of a very comprehensive housing plan. But the bottom line of your question, and the piece that I hope everybody watching understands, is we added more than 100,000 people to our province last year. That was a 60-year high in population growth. We've never seen population growth like that. First 2 quarters of this year, we broke last year's record. And if we want to get ahead of where we're at on housing, you can't find a place to rent, and there's 50 people lined up at the open house, even in a situation of rising interest rates, then we have to build a lot more housing, and that's what we're going to do.
It's hard to know exactly which direction to go in, because housing, of course, goes in so many different directions. But if we, just to finish off on talking about downtown east side, and we have this challenge. People keep coming specifically to live there as well. It's not as well as just the rest of the province. And right now, and as you know, you've had the catch and release repeat offenders report sent to you. I know you're trying to push back with the federal government on Bill C-75. We have this homelessness, but we also have a growing sense of some lawlessness. We saw the unfortunate death of a young man in front of his family just a couple blocks from where we are tonight. How do we start to try and work with it, moving in a different direction? The trend seems to be towards more random acts of violence. As Doug Lepard had said, a sense amongst people that they are emboldened, that they're going to be arrested and they'll be let go. The Vancouver Police the other day just released a story about one chronic offender who went in, released, out, breaks the law again. Can we, do we have now the will and the ability to push back against that and start to create safer downtowns? I know that it's not the same issue throughout the province, but particularly downtown.
Thanks. There's so much in that question. So when we talk about kind of the visible street disorder post-pandemic in many downtown cores across the province, not just the downtown east side, and in other parts, and I don't know if you've had the chance to go down Washington State post-pandemic, some of the news coming out of California, some of the challenges they're facing. We face similar issues here, and there's definitely an underlying issue of mental health and addiction component to it, and people who it seems kind of over the pandemic period got even more disconnected from services and are really struggling now. And we also have a lot of folks who've overdosed on really toxic drugs who survive. We often hear about the deaths, which are tragic and devastating. But then people who survive with serious brain injuries, who are walking around with serious brain injuries from their overdose, causing some of this challenge as well. So we've had to put a significant amount of resource into mental health and addiction services in the province, $1 billion in the budget, which includes health, human resources training to train up workers to work in those facilities to support people. Housing, complex care housing, we're calling it, which is housing with healthcare-like supports in it. Because we put people into supportive housing and they set their room on fire or they're hoarding, they last for 2 weeks and then they move back out to the street, so that those folks have a chance to stay in housing. They can go from hospital back to housing. And then there is a serious issue of violent attacks. We saw in Toronto the stabbing on the TTC of a 16-year-old. We saw stabbings on transit in Alberta. We saw a 16-year-old shoot 2 police officers in Alberta. Here in BC, a father stabbed at a Starbucks, a stabbing on a bus in Surrey. The sense, and it's not just us, we join nationally with other premiers. I joined nationally with other premiers, the Attorney General and Public Safety Minister, with other Justice Ministers, with the federal government about a class of offenders that is committing offenses under federal bail rules, then being released back into community instead of waiting for trial in jail. Really challenging issues. So the feds have committed, thanks to our leadership and pushing on this issue, to change their bail rules to address that issue. We have 10 teams of new prosecutors paired with probation officers and correction officers to track repeat chronic offenders, so that the full set of facts is in front of the court to maximize the possibility of that person not being released to commit another offense. They'll be in 10 different communities. They're going to start work beginning of next month. They're being trained right now. They've been hired. And so we're going to do our part here, but recognizing mental health and addiction, more CAR programs, police officers with a mental health nurse out in communities, so that it's police plus mental health services responding to calls. More peer programs when someone's struggling with mental health in a downtown space and people call 911, that it's 2 people, a mental health worker and a person with lived experience, who respond, taking the pressure off police. A pilot program in North Vancouver took a lot of pressure off police, successfully connecting people to services. It takes all these problems, and I can tell, it's just like, oh my gosh, EB is just talking. It's like every angle we have to go at these things, because none of these problems, public safety, healthcare, housing, economic issues that we face, are simple fixes. And people will tell you they're simple fixes. They're not. We need to go at it at 15 different angles to address it, and that's what we're doing.
Ron?
Premier, you mentioned the immigration numbers, which are, as you say, record. The former head of the Public Service, Don Wright, wrote a piece recently, and he said, he just asked the question whether the immigration numbers coming into British Columbia, because so many of the immigrants that come to Canada come to BC, whether those numbers are not so high that they'll swamp your best efforts to give everyone a family doctor and to make housing affordable, that there's just no way to keep up with the immigration numbers. Do you think he might have a point?
So he's absolutely right with the growth that we've seen in this province, that the province has to respond. I'll expand it a little bit. We have seen dramatic in-migration to our province from other provinces, from Ontario, from Alberta, as well as from other countries. And everyone here in the room knows why. We have an amazing province. It's beautiful here. We've done well economically. We have a low unemployment rate. There are jobs. There's opportunity here. People are like, I want to live there. And I get that, and that's exciting, and that's good news for our province. I don't know if you've ever lived in a place that's shrinking, that's losing population. You have to run ad campaigns to encourage people to come, and that's hard. It's not a great situation. And so it's good news that people want to come to British Columbia, but we have to respond, and we need a strong federal partner to respond to the growth that we're seeing. So for our healthcare system, for housing, for education system, all public services, basic infrastructure, roads, transit. One of the big challenges we've seen, Vaughn, is that Ottawa, and this is a perennial complaint, I'm sure you have heard this from premiers of every stripe. Ottawa is in Ontario, and it is beside Quebec, and those provinces are front of mind every day for federal politicians. And there are also electoral reasons to be particularly interested in Ontario and Quebec. And happily, in a minority parliament, BC assumes a larger importance on that. But it has been clear to me that we need to get our fair share of federal funding, to the point that I led a trade mission of our ministers to Ottawa to remind them about us, to meet face-to-face, because we've been doing Zoom calls, we've been doing telephone calls. It was so obvious to me that you have to be face-to-face with them and build those personal relationships with Ottawa to make sure that BC just gets our per capita share. And it would be great if they looked at BC and said, hey, wow, so many people are choosing to live in your province that are coming to Canada. We're going to give you additional funding. But honestly, Vaughn, I would be so happy if they said, we'll just give you your per capita share of federal funding. That would be great news for us. The realities of immigration to British Columbia are that we are failing to leverage the skills and abilities of people who are coming here to help build our province. Two short stories, I'm sorry. One, I was at PowerTech, which is BC Hydro's research arm, touring through the building with Minister Freeland, who came out to talk about her budget. And all of a sudden, this woman starts talking to Minister Freeland in Ukrainian, just talking, like, what's going on? So they talked for like 5 minutes for standing around awkwardly. And then she's like, this is Victoria. She just came here from Ukraine. She's a refugee in British Columbia. She's a PhD in electrical engineering. She's working here at PowerTech doing research around electrical something. And so that was a really good news story for Victoria, but for every Victoria, there's like 5 or 10 people that have expertise, knowledge from whichever country they came from, where they're not able to use it. Teachers, medical professionals. And so fast-tracking credential recognition broadly, maintaining high standards, but making sure that regulators have a clear pathway for people to have their credentials recognized. We lure them over, we say, you have this special skill. We want you to come to Canada. We want you to come to British Columbia. And then when you get here, you are not allowed to work with your special skill. But thank you for coming. It's so frustrating for them. It doesn't help build our province. And it creates the impression that immigration is something that it's not. Which is it's something that helps us build our province. It's good news for our province, but we have to make sure it is good news that we're leveraging the skills that are coming to British Columbia in the forms of new arrivals.
BC Hydro, since you mentioned it, one of your other ambitious plans is the one to electrify British Columbia, and I gather not with your personality. Sorry.
Shots fired. It's okay, Vaughn.
But seriously, as a plan, it is very ambitious. LNG, we're talking about vehicles, truck fleets, ferries, factories, pulp mills, everything. The initial work that I've seen suggests that we don't have anything like that amount of electricity online coming anytime soon. And as I recall your own speech on this, you said that it takes, from what your understanding is, 8 or 9 years to approve new generating capacity transmission lines in British Columbia, and that's too long. So what is the part of the plan that deals with that?
We have a really interesting situation in BC that we have this huge advantage, which is this clean, it's called firm power, a term I learned about, but basically means that you can use it when you need it. You don't have to wait for the wind to blow. You don't have to wait for the sun to shine. It's available for you. It's such a huge advantage that BC Hydro made almost $1 billion last year selling electricity on demand to jurisdictions outside British Columbia through PowerX, through the trading arm. They trade hydro all the way down to California. And so that $1 billion helped reduce bills for BC Hydro customers, helped reduce costs for British Columbia. It's very good news exporting almost $1 billion worth of electricity. But that advantage isn't just in potentially exporting electricity to jurisdictions like Washington State, where they want to close coal-fired plants and replace it with, one assumes, some BC electricity. or to Alberta to help them hit their emissions targets. It's also a big economic advantage for us. Where we have sites where there used to be a pulp mill or a lumber mill, and there's a BC Hydro feed there, there's interest and investment because the infrastructure is already there. But if you show up and you're like a company that has a significant hydro demand, you want to build in British Columbia, we say, welcome to British Columbia. Yes, you can do a needs study. I don't remember what the technical term is. It costs about $5 million for a big one, about the amount of electricity you're going to need. And then once we approve it, then it'll be anywhere between 6 to 9 years to actually build the electricity you need. And Quebec has taken an approach where they're building the hydro. They want to build the hydro in advance of demand, and I think they're absolutely right. And the federal government thinks they're right too. They just in their budget announced tax credits to help build out that transmission and generation capacity in advance of demand to lure business to Canada. It's ideally suited for British Columbia. I'm really excited about it. And it's going to be good news for our province because it's a huge advantage for us.
We're going to go to a question from Slido right now. Change the topic.
Sure.
Sean?
Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you, Stuart. From Brent Morrison. Over the last 10 years or so, it's become tougher to get a family doctor. I know there are doctors from other countries who aren't able to practice here. Why can't we find a way to allow them to work here to help deal with our shortage?
That's a great question, Brent. My wife is a family doctor, and so when I meet people out in the community, they say, "Oh, you're the premier. Oh, that's very interesting. That's great. Nice to meet you." And then and I'm like, "This is my partner, Kaylee." And then they say, "Oh, and what do you do?" And she says, "I'm a family doctor." Like, "Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Are you taking new patients? Like, where do you practice?" And so they're so much more excited to see her. There are a huge number of British Columbians looking for family doctors. There are two significant pieces to our government's response to that. First is we have a new agreement with family doctors, recognizing the work that they do, making sure that they are, it used to be that the best family doctor jobs was not to be a family doctor, to work in a drop-in clinic, to work in a hospital as a hospitalist. That's where you got paid the most. That's where you didn't have the huge responsibility of maintaining a whole business. And this agreement tries to shift that so that the best family doctor jobs are these, it's called longitudinal practice, but it's just the family doctor that you expect. There's a family doctor that has a relationship with you and your family and looks after you over your lifetime. And so that's really important. It was a very significant agreement with Doctors of BC, and we've seen doctors come online. But specific to the question, and really importantly, is recognizing and supporting people to practice medicine that have the skills from other places. And so we have created 90 new spaces at UBC for doctors that are internationally trained, so they can be assessed and trained quickly and come up to speed quickly to be family doctors in BC. They have something called a return of service, which means they have to practice in an underserved area of the province if they're participating in the program. There's a new category of physician that we've created. You're allowed to work as an internationally trained doctor under the supervision of another doctor, right now just in a hospital, but soon with family physicians as well. And then beyond that, we're looking with the federal government in partnership to identify places where people are able to come as family doctors and start practicing immediately through credential recognition. In British Columbia, we have to work with the regulator and the federal government around immigration rules, but there's a lot of promise there as well. So Brent is right on target with his question. That's exactly where we're going, but we're also, medium and long term, building the first new medical school in 50 years in British Columbia, and it's going to be in Surrey, and the focus of it through SFU is community health workers, family doctors, and people who are interested in doing medicine in community, so that the people are accepted and trained through that program. That's what they want to do, that's what the training focuses on, and when they come out the other end, to support our growing population.
So you may have seen in the news this morning that the Supreme Court of Canada is not going to hear the appeal from Brian Day and other private clinics. And if we take a look at the incredible number of people who we've already acknowledged are coming into the province, How do you, if we're not going to allow any other kind of release valve from the system that already has long waiting lists, how do we intend to meet those waiting list challenges moving forward?
So we do have some private clinics in British Columbia that provide services to the government of BC. That case is not about those private clinics. It's about a different issue of whether or not those private clinics can provide public health care services and charge for them as well. The important thing, I think, there are two important things to take from this. One is private healthcare the solution to the challenges we face in the healthcare system right now? And I have yet to be persuaded that that is the case. The reason is the overwhelming issue that we face appears to me to be, when I talk to doctors and nurses and others, is a shortage of key personnel in our hospitals to respond to the demand. And so if we create a parallel system where the physicians and nurses, health sciences professionals and others are better paid and they leave the public system to go to the private system, we are not ahead of the game. It's the same number of doctors and nurses. The line is still there. You've only changed who's at the front of the line, the people who can afford to pay for the private clinics. There are lessons, though, that we can learn from the private clinics. Those that are operating in British Columbia, and a number of them have very specific specialties that they do. They do a huge number of operations of a very specific kind in a high volume, and they are incredibly efficient at it. And so we can learn lessons for the public healthcare system from that. There's no special magic about the private sector that enables them to do this and also charge not just the cost of operating, but as well as a profit margin to taxpayers. The public system can do that too. We can learn those lessons. We can have those specialized clinics. One of the reasons why we were able to get through the COVID backlog around things like imaging, for example, was buying out the imaging machines from private clinics, running them 24 hours in the public system to chew through that backlog. So we can learn lessons. We can make our public health care system better. We don't have to be ideological about it, but I want to be really clear that I think that a public healthcare system for British Columbians is the best way to address this issue, because it means that there's not a competing and parallel system drawing resources out of the public system.
The other headline on the healthcare thing that I noticed this morning is the province of Ontario has announced it's going to expedite approval of foreign practitioners, medical practitioners, the question that Brent just asked. And I note as well this week that your government has announced some significant incentives to attract nurses to British Columbia. Is there a risk here that what you're going to get is the provinces playing one-up-personship with each other on incentives, when in fact the real problem is the pool of practitioners is just not big enough to answer the national demand?
Well, I think that is a very significant concern. And where's the camera that's live? Is that the camera? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say to people out there, yes, it's true. BC is the best place in Canada to be a nurse. I can't argue with that, Vaughn. You're right. But it is an issue. We don't want to be fighting other provinces for healthcare professionals, but there are huge barriers to the flow of healthcare professionals between provinces, which means we can't share healthcare professionals the way that we should be able to. And we can't support each other in the way that we should through healthcare workers. There's a lot of concern from some provinces that if there was a free flow, that everyone will move to BC. I don't think that's the case. There's lots of BC doctors and nurses and health professionals that travel to other provinces to provide services and come back. And making that easier is going to benefit all of us, but also making the flow easier from other countries where they have very similar standards to us. They could easily practice in our healthcare system is going to benefit Canada as well. We're better together, I believe, but you're right. We all have to be increasing that pool. We have had an issue in BC of training people up, particularly nurses, and then having them leave to other jurisdictions as they thought it was better somewhere else. So again, yes, we are the best place for a nurse to practice in Canada now and going forward. But it is an issue, and so we've had other provinces come to recruit people directly, and so we shouldn't be competing with each other. We should be working together.
Next time I'm going to get you to give me a list of things you'd like to advertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Save me a lot of time. I want to go back to housing. Is part of the problem in delivering on your housing targets that BC Housing is a pretty troubled agency? I mean, you ordered a review, you ordered a forensic audit, you replaced the board, and you've said yourself that they're only approving about one of 4 or 5 applications that they get for social housing. So is that one of the big blocks, one of the big obstacles to meeting your targets?
Well, the demand for housing is massive, and especially the demand for the most affordable kind of housing. So we've put record amounts of money into building social supportive housing, affordable housing for that sort of fixed income group that I was really talking about. And the nonprofits have really responded. So for every funding application that BC Housing gets through our granting program, there's at least 2 or 3 that are not getting funded. And so in this budget, we put enough money in for 4,000 more units, and so we'll be able to draw on that backlog to fund some projects that are ready to go, which is good news. BC Housing is a flow-through for this. The nonprofits partner often with builders to deliver the housing. And so the challenges that BC Housing faces right now are not affecting that work. The challenge, though, with BC Housing is we have put a huge amount of money into housing. They are an organization that for many years was basically kind of a catch-what-you-can-eat kind of organization, and putting together deals and so on. And they didn't have the controls or the safeguards in place for the volume of public money that we were putting in through there to make sure that the nonprofits are hitting the targets and the standards that we want, that they're delivering the spaces in the way that we want, to make sure that there's accountability for taxpayers. It was something that was very obvious to me on taking over as housing minister. So we brought in a third-party business firm to provide a set of recommendations. That firm identified some further issues, which resulted in me asking the Comptroller General with the Minister of Finance to have a look at BC Housing. That report will be released to the public, all of it with the aim of making BC Housing strong so that it can deliver for British Columbians. The core of your question, I think you started with saying the reason you're not hitting your targets. There are 42,000 families in British Columbia that have housing now that wouldn't have had housing without our policies because of housing we built, because of the speculation and vacancy tax, turning vacant units into units that people are renting right now in my own community, previously vacant mansions being rented out by students. It's been effective. BC Housing is currently the biggest developer in Canada, residential housing developer in Canada, probably one of the biggest residential housing developers in North America. There are 21,000 units at some stage of the development pipeline, under construction, under consideration by a city council, funded and starting that process, 21,000. And so these things are moving through, but the development process is so slow. We have one building we've been trying to build at Broadway and Arbutus in my community for a long time. Neighbors were very upset about it. There were weeks of public hearings. It took months to get to the public hearings. This is housing that everyone agrees is needed. And then there was a lawsuit filed, and it's been completely stalled out. And despite there being a housing crisis, we're now going into year 2, and it's still not built. And so we need to deal with those issues and get the housing actually built to be able to have people move in and deal with some of the housing crisis. So that is another issue. And it's not just the cities, it's the province too, and our own permitting piece that we're dealing with. I go into that too, but there's so much there, Vaughn.
The forensic audit that you ordered into BC Housing has not been released. It's being shown to, according to your government statements, it's being shown to the entities and individuals that are named in the report. How many of those individuals and organizations are there? And do they have a veto over what the public gets shown from this report?
My commitment around this report, the reason why it was commissioned, was to make sure that the public has confidence in what we're doing around housing, that we're addressing any issues at BC Housing. So my commitment around the report is that it's going to be released to the full extent that the law allows. There's a process that we have to follow in order to be able to do that, and we're following that process right now. And it is not so that people can edit the report. We have to follow this process in order to be able to publicly release the report.
I want to switch to the economy. I'm going to start with a question from Slido, question number 2 there about forestry, but then we'll come back to where are we going with BC's economy. Sean?
Thank you, Stuart. We've seen a lot of layoffs in forestry because of a shortage of timber. How can we keep this industry sustainable, and how is your approach different from the one that got us into this problem?
Thanks. That's a great question. There are sections of our economy that are doing so remarkably well, and there are sections of our economy that are very challenged. Forestry is one of them. It's almost a perfect storm for forestry right now. A low timber price after skyrocketing timber price over the pandemic. The wildfire burning up so much supply of trees that communities were counting on in terms of being able to feed mills and keep things moving. And just poor forest management practices where there wasn't long-range planning, there wasn't long-term community landscape planning done about here are the areas we're going to log. And so the shortage of supply of trees, they call it fiber in the industry, is particularly acute in the interior, in the Prince George area, Vancouver Island less so. And then layer on top of that a broad public concern, and rightly so, about protecting old growth forests and iconic trees and some of the iconic images that you think about when you think about British Columbia, sort of natural wild spaces, heritage that we're all proud of. And so this is an incredibly challenging time for industry. And so our government commitment has been around our old growth strategy, around getting more value for all of the trees that we have in the province, more jobs per tree. And so it's things like we had Crofton Mill, which went down because of there was a combination of a lack of fiber supply, but also just concerns about the market for the kind of paper they were producing from the mill. 100 people lost their jobs. We partnered with the federal government to support the company running that mill to be able to reopen that line to produce single-use utensils that aren't plastic out of forest waste. And so reopened the line. They believe that they're going to be able to transition from using trees entirely to using a waste paper to produce similar utensils, ensuring the sustainability of the jobs at that mill that is so important to the city of Crofton for the whole community. And these are the kinds of solutions we have to come to. So for some, it's community forests that are managed by the community landscape planning that we're doing to make sure that there's sustainable supply for mills going forward. They know what they can cut, they know what's coming. Partnerships with First Nations. In other communities, it's around our mass timber program, where we're encouraging builders to use these mass timber manufactured products instead of steel or concrete, which have higher carbon emissions. We're creating jobs in BC and we're reducing emissions. It is just like all the other challenges we've been talking about for the forestry industry, it's no one solution. One of the really neat things that we funded was the Forest Enhancement Society goes out and recovers waste from forestry operations and brings it to pulp mills. We cover the cost difference to bring that forest waste to the pulp mill to keep the pulp mill running so it doesn't get burned in the field. It actually goes to feed jobs in BC, and all we do is cover the difference in the cost. It's a fascinating area. It's an iconic industry in the province, and it has to be an industry that supports people going forward for generations. It's so important, but it's going to take some work with industry and communities to get there.
Do you still foresee forestry playing a major role in the economy of British Columbia? And I ask that question because if we take a look at a company like Teal Jones, which is doing absolutely everything that has been asked of forestry companies, working with First Nations, having sound environmental policies, developing products. They have over 15,000 products. I know I'm sounding like I'm doing an ad for them, but I looked into this company and they're doing everything that we have asked them to do, and then they get targeted by environmentalists, and when they're looking for investment to continue to grow, they're looking beyond British Columbia, because it's as though British Columbia has said, it doesn't matter how well you do, meeting all of those objectives, it's still not enough.
Yeah, there's absolutely a future for forestry in our province, and you can see it. You can visit the mills that are producing all kinds of different wood products for people in British Columbia and for export. But the industry is changing, and it has to change. It has to change for a number of reasons. One is we have different values now around First Nations participation so that the economic activity benefits everybody in the local area. Around preservation of wild spaces, people have different standards now around old growth. And we need to make sure that we're playing a leadership role here, and we can. I mean, we're a forestry province. We have huge advantages in being able to do this work. But the industry is changing, and it has to change. And I'm actually going to the Council of Forest Industries next week in Prince George to have this exact conversation directly with the forestry companies, because they all know that too. I had great meetings with Mosaic this week, and they are doing some really innovative stuff with carbon credits and production on Vancouver Island right now. So there's all kinds of exciting things happening right now.
So overall, as far as your economic strategy is concerned, what do you foresee or characterize it as being BC's advantages, and where's the economy going to grow, and how can your government help them do that?
The sectors where I see huge opportunity for us, where I'm really excited about the province, one of your sponsors here is Stem Cell. I had a meeting with, I toured their facilities. Abcellera is another one. In the Lower Mainland here, that biotech sector is going gangbusters. The innovation, the connection with UBC and the research that's happening at that school, and the spin-offs and the thousands of jobs that are being created there, as well as the promise of the potential of a homegrown pharmaceutical industry that focuses on antibody drugs and custom, like next generation medicine, is just incredible, and it's so exciting. They combined have expansion plans that probably amount to in excess of $1 billion, and it's so exciting. So biotech is a huge piece here in the Lower Mainland. I was up in Prince Rupert. They have this really exciting proposal around hydrogen export, a closed loop system. They have a huge port there. It's one of the busiest ports in North America. And they're expanding rapidly there. But one of the exports they'd like to do is clean hydrogen through electrical generation, producing the hydrogen on site and shipping it directly out from Prince Rupert. Very advanced, very exciting work that they're doing there. The whole hydrogen economy, because of Ballard fuel cells, is doing really well here in BC. There's a lot of intellectual property that's tied to our province. There's a cluster of businesses around hydrogen. Everyone from Fortis, sort of an institutional player here in BC, and the work that they're doing to bring on hydrogen economy, to new players that are starting. There's a company called Hydra Energy that bubbles hydrogen into diesel engines to reduce their fuel use. And it's a very simple conversion for a diesel truck. It reduces their emissions. Hydrogen as a service, a really exciting part of our economy. There's so many exciting things happening in our province right now, as well as traditional industries. We just permitted our first new mine in British Columbia in 10 years, Artemis Gold Mine, multi-billion-dollar investment in partnership with First Nations. It's a great time to be in BC.
Another question from Slido. Question number 2 there, Sean.
Thank you, Stuart. Governments around the world are failing to meet their climate targets. How does BC strike the balance between development of our resources and hitting our targets?
Thanks. That's a great question. There's definitely a narrative that we have to choose between development in the province and hitting our carbon targets. A couple of weeks ago, I joined. It's not true. A couple of weeks ago, I joined with Haisla First Nation to announce provincial approval of their Cedar LNG project. That nation has struggled with poverty for a long time. It's going to be transformative for their community. It's going to be some of the lowest emission LNG in the world, and it's going to facilitate them transitioning to a zero emission community as a whole, and they're going to work with us to get to net zero for 2030. So very exciting announcement there. But we also made a commitment to British Columbians on getting elected, which is that we face a very serious issue with climate change. Here in BC, we see some of the worst impacts: the smoky summers, the floods, the impacts of pine beetle that can overwinter now, and so on. It seems like we and down the West Coast are seeing some of the worst impacts of climate change. And so we've got to do our part in hitting the global targets that Canada has committed to, and BC's got to do our part. So we also announced that we'll be introducing new legislation to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. and that every new LNG or fossil fuel project that is proposed in the province has to be net zero by 2030. We're currently working with industry, and industry has some of these same goals. Shell, which is one of the main proponents of the LNG Canada project, has made international commitments around their own emissions that are very similar to BC's. So we're hopeful to work together with industry to be able to hit those targets, but our law will require that those targets are met. We said that the targets were serious, that all projects had to comply with them, and we'll be introducing that legislation.
Hearing a lot of complaints that in spite of the government's efforts to expand access to childcare in BC, that it is very difficult to find, and hearing complaints too from private operators that they don't think the government really sees a future for private childcare operation, that the government would sooner in the long run have it all be public or nonprofit. Is that fair criticism of your government? Where is the solution in the medium term to what many people see as still a shortage of childcare?
There's no question in the province that demand for childcare, especially before and after school programs and programs for infants, really young kids, exceeds current availability of childcare. But our government has done a lot to open thousands of spaces across the province, and far more affordable spaces. We partnered with the federal government. Parents who have kids in childcare now saw a 50% reduction in their fees just a couple months ago. And that is huge for families. That can mean thousands of dollars, more than $1,000, well, depending on how big your family is, I guess. And you have quadruplets. For some families, more than $1,000 a month in savings. Really big deal for them. $10 a day childcare has transformed the lives of many, many families across our province. And the understanding that we have an intention of seeing childcare as part of our public school system is correct. But that doesn't mean that there's not a role for private providers. Private providers are participating in our programs, including our subsidy programs. But we did move childcare into the Ministry of Education because we want a seamless experience for parents. And when your child goes into childcare, that they then go into the before and after school program when they start kindergarten. It's tied to the school so that when they're going through, what parents have to do right now is they kind of cobble it together and you get the perfect system. I can speak from some experience. You can never move, right? You've got your before and after school program, you've got your child care, everything has to stay the way it is, no sudden movements. And so we want to get away from that, where, there's the child care in your community where your kid goes into the program and that they're going, and if you have to move, there's a similar program at the other school in the other community that you're moving to. This is our long range vision. It's the first new social program in a generation in the province. We've done well so far in expanding it, but we know there's a lot more work to do.
One of the first statements you made when you decided to seek the leadership of the NDP sounded very sympathetic to the idea of involuntary care, mandatory treatment in some cases involving drugs and mental health. Since then, it's almost as if you've been moving away from that position. So where do you stand now on those two issues?
So the $1 billion investment that we're putting into mental health and addiction includes support for involuntary care. So when we have a system under the Mental Health Act, you need 2 physicians to sign off for someone to be involuntarily admitted. When physicians and we've expanded that now that nurse practitioners are also able to do that to take some pressure off emergency room physicians. If a physician or nurse practitioner makes that difficult decision, we don't want them to be thinking, is there a bed? Is there a space? Or if we have it, is it okay, or is it maybe going to cause more harm than good in terms of involuntarily admitting this person? That there's space available. So we have the Redfish Center at the old Riverview site. It's been very successful, but we need significantly more of them. So we're going to be opening similar sites across the province so that they're regionally available, so people have access to that care when they need it, where they need it. The other issue that we have to come up with a solution with, I've asked Minister Whiteside to take on this profoundly challenging issue, and this is the context of my remarks, is when people overdose, typically on fentanyl or carfentanil, and revived, resuscitated in the emergency room, and then they check out against medical advice, and they go out and they use again, and they overdose again. They're brought back to the emergency room, and they're revived, and then they go out and they're brought back again. I was telling this story, and the Mayor Burnaby came up. My Curly, he's a former firefighter. He said I had someone who did 4 times in one day, and I was called to that person 4 times in a row. I've had physicians say they've had people do 5 times in a day, and they keep going until they're brain injured or they die. Brain injured to the point that they don't leave the hospital or they die. And I just think that we have to do better. Part of that is a new model at St. Paul's, where people will go have the opportunity to go directly from the emergency room into detox, into treatment, all on site at the hospital. It's a new model we're working on with them with some of this funding. But the other part is, and I said in voluntary care in relation to this group, and I was told by experts, look, if you do that, people who overdose will not, people who are with people who overdose will not take their friend to the hospital, will not call the ambulance because they don't want them to be involuntarily committed at the hospital. So it'll be less likely to access the emergency services. So I don't pretend to have all the answers on this issue about the best way forward, but I know that the status quo is unacceptable, that in emergency rooms, the nurses and doctors who work there, the people who are there, they can't be treating the same person 4 and 5 times in a day. And so finding ways that we can respond to this in a way that's compassionate, but make sure that we recognize that this is not an acceptable situation, is how we have to move forward. It's an incredibly difficult issue, Vaughn.
So, because we only have a limited amount of time, we have to keep changing topics. I'd like to talk to you about transportation infrastructure.
We only have limited time.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'd like to keep you here for 3 or 4 hours. Transportation. And there's a couple of components to it. Working with the Port of Vancouver, moving goods through the Lower Mainland and out across the country. When we're in the Lower Mainland, there is a bottleneck. There had been a gateway strategy a number of years ago, and it seems to have been stalled a little bit. Going out beyond 216th Avenue, suddenly you get into this kind of gridlock that just shuts everything down. And then, of course, we had the canceling of the Dease tunnel replacement, or the Massey Tunnel replacement project. What's your strategy? What are you thinking about as far as a transportation infrastructure plan throughout the Lower Mainland that will then also extend to move goods out of the province as quickly as possible?
Thanks. Great question. I had a really productive meeting actually with CN today talking about some of these issues. They, along with truck operators, along with families and people who commute for work, they've been living further and further away from work, and so they're spending more time on the highway. Everybody knows that we have to continue to expand transportation capacity in the province. So I've asked the Minister of Transportation and the Minister of State, who's the MLA for Chilliwack, to work together to accelerate our Highway 1 expansion plans to support families, to support movement of goods and so on. But we know that just building more roads isn't going to solve this problem, which is why our government has put record amounts of investment into transit, the new Surrey-Langley SkyTrain as an example, to give people a chance to get out of their cars and use rapid transit. I remain excited about the Broadway SkyTrain and my hopes that ultimately it will make it all the way out to UBC and work with our government, UBC, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on that as well, so that we have seamless transportation, rapid transit from UBC all the way out to Surrey. And also the North Shore. They have huge issues with we've all waited for the bridge, and we have friends on the other side who we miss very much, but when they moved to the North Shore, we said, see you later. So we know that has to improve as well, and the mandate letter for the Minister of Transportation asks that they speed up our assessment of what our options are to get over to the North Shore. And on Massey Tunnel, we're looking at ways that permitting, given the fact that the river is there, the permitting around fisheries with the federal government. There are 21 First Nations that have interests from fisheries to direct territorial interests in the area. We're looking at ways that we can accelerate the permitting and engagement process to get the construction happening faster. It's not like it was in the 50s where you just dropped a couple tubes in the river and Bob's your uncle and it's done. We have to be a little more sophisticated about it. Everyone loves salmon. They want the salmon to be okay, but they also want to get to work and get to school. So we're doing that work right now.
Back onto housing, a couple of things that have come up just since you announced it. The one is the message in the housing plan that really, at least in our major urban centers, we're looking at the end of the line for single-family housing?
I think the message is that we're really concerned about the future of the province and the future of communities. Single-family homes will continue to be built. They'll continue to be bought by people who are a shrinking minority of people who can afford them. But the question is, how do we ensure that the young person who's trying to start their lives living with mom and dad, they're in their 30s, they're wondering, like, what is the plan here? Do I have to leave British Columbia to start my life? Or you're talking about the senior who's living in a home that used to be a family home, and they're like, I want to stay in this community. All my friends are here. All the stores I like are here. All the restaurants I like are here. But there's no housing that's appropriately sized for me. And I'm incredibly wealthy on paper with this house, but I don't have the kind of disposable income that I need to support myself. To provide solutions for these really challenging issues and to provide a new lease on life for some neighborhoods where you've seen shrinking population and they still have all the infrastructure. They still have the schools, they still have the parks, and they still have the pipes, but there's just one person living in the house instead of 5 or 6. And so the message is that we're missing a whole kind of housing in our communities that are desperately needed. And because of that missing housing, it's called missing middle, or it's called gentle density, or it's called housing you can actually afford as a human, because of that missing housing, it's threatening our economic success, it's threatening the future of our communities, it's threatening the ability to deliver healthcare or education services because those workers aren't there. And so that is really the message. I strongly believe that those single-family homes are going to stay there, and people are going to buy them, and they're going to live in them, and that'll be fine. But what keeps me awake at night is how do we support those people who don't see a future for themselves in the province.
The Housing Supply Act gave the provincial government the power to overrule local councils on housing issues. How often do you think you'll have to use those powers?
For those of you that don't follow the legislature as closely as Vaughan does, there's legislation that was passed shortly after I became premier. It allows us to set housing targets in partnership with local governments, saying this number of housing units of this kind, this number of housing units of this kind, working together with their population projections to make sure we're actually approving the housing together that needs to get built. And then what happens if those numbers aren't hit? What happens if the local government refuses to approve those kinds of housing? Less likely. How do we address this issue? It does have the ultimate hammer at the end, which is that an advisor can go in, look at the local government's plan and say, provincial government, you should approve this kind of housing in this area because the local government's not doing it, and it's obvious that that should be happening. And so it's not government directly, it's through an intermediary. Ontario has a system where the Ontario Municipal Board overrules local governments in terms of planning decisions that they make. We decided not to go with that model. But our hope is that we don't have to use it. Our hope is that we're working together with local governments, that we agree, this is your population growth, this is the housing that we need, this is what you need to get there, and then we work together to hit that target. I do know that I have had debates back and forth with local governments sometimes. And so it won't always be that smooth. But I also know that we both have the same goals, which is a strong community. And if we can find the way to get to to move forward on that will be successful.
But you really do have to work together with him, because you can't come along from the outside and say, okay, we're going to increase density in an area that has been single-family housing, without recognizing that the infrastructure that's needed from water, sewage, electricity, roads, schools, other services all have to be in place as well. It can't be mandated just you have to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have to work together. But there are situations where we have areas in this province that are directly beside transit, where the public has spent literally billions of dollars to build high-speed transit to move people. And there are lots that are only zoned for very low densities right next to the transit. And that's a challenge. So we have actually this massive infrastructure. It's the exact opposite of what you described. You have this massive infrastructure, and then it's not being used to benefit the community. And so those are the conversations, and they're hard conversations that we are going to have, but the legislation requires us both to have them to work together.
Former Premier John Horgan has gone to work for a major resource company regulated by the province. There's no rule against it. Should there be?
Yeah, there's a Globe and Mail story recently where Vaughn, you and I were chuckling about it. John was his usual self, saying he didn't give a damn what people's opinion was about it. He joined Elk Valley Resources, which Teck has spun off. It's their steelmaking coal arm, or they intend to spin off from their overall mining sector. So he's working for not just a resource company, but a coal company. And steelmaking coal is a product we need, and we need it to produce steel. And it's something that British Columbia produces. And I'm glad that he's helping build up our provincial economy. And the suggestion, Vaughn, I guess, in your question is an issue of conflict of interest in relation to the company. The rule is when you leave government, we have a rule around joining a lobbyist agency. There's a cooling off period that's required. I have every confidence that John will recuse himself from any matter that involves a conflict of interest. And I think Elk Valley Resources is lucky to get him.
Another former Premier question. Glenn Clark offered his services recently after he stepped down from Pattison's company. Have you figured out what to do with them yet?
Yeah, I was thrilled. It's not every day that that you as government get an offer from someone who is leading the largest private company in the province to come and work for $1 a day on some kind of project. So I'm still working with Glenn to find out what the most appropriate place would be. He offered in an article BC Housing. I don't think that's quite the right fit. But I do think he has remarkable skills and connections that'll help move the province forward. He knows how government works, and he climbed to the top of the Pattison group, had Mr. Pattison's confidence, and did a great job for them. So we would do well to get him, and that discussion is ongoing, Vaughn.
We'll go to one more question from Slido, and then we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for the amount of time and energy that you put into answering all these questions. One more question from Slido.
So BC had a major opportunity to pay down the debt with the multi-billion-dollar surplus. Why didn't you?
So that's a great question. I'm so glad someone asked that. Thank you for asking that question. We third quarter, we're projecting provincially a $5 billion surplus for the province. And I think it's a real distinction between our government and the opposition on this issue. A couple of the initiatives that we proposed to spend, well, almost all of them, but those that went to a vote, we proposed to spend some of the surplus on, the opposition voted against. Now, for context, I believe that there are multiple kinds of deficits. There's certainly financial deficits, but there are also infrastructure deficits and capacity deficits in our province. So if you have failed to invest in the pipes in Prince Rupert for 100 years, and they're about to collapse, and it is the third busiest port in North America, and at risk of not having water, and you have a $5 billion financial surplus, I believe that investing that money in that infrastructure deficit is an important thing to do. But I'll give you two examples. One was next generation 911 services in our province, $150 million tab. This is if you're unable to talk, you can text first responders. You can send pictures to first responders through your phone, through the 911 system. $150 million. The cost was going to fall onto municipalities, which actually means it was going to fall onto ratepayers and municipalities. We said provincially, we'll pay that $150 million because we have this money available. And the opposition voted against it. We voted for it. The other example, $800 million for cancer care in our province, in particular, funding research through BC Cancer so that they can partner with Stem Cell, they can partner with AbCellera, so that BC patients get access to first-round clinical testing of new treatments for cancer, which acts as a huge attractant to researchers who are also cancer doctors to work in British Columbia. And we voted for it, and the BC Liberals voted against it. So I believe, our government believes, in using that surplus to support people in the province. There are lots of people who are struggling in different ways. Our healthcare system is struggling. We want to address issues of public safety. We want to address issues of housing. These are crisis issues for people, that was the best investment of that money. The opposition disagreed, which means that, in my opinion, they were voting for longer cancer waits. They were voting for a less safe 911 system. They were voting against these important initiatives. We'll have that debate during the election. I'm a strong believer in government delivering for British Columbians, and our debt to GDP ratio is going down. And the debt that we're putting on the books in the province is to build infrastructure that will serve British Columbians for many years. And so all of our financial indicators from all the bond rating agencies are positive. We have the best credit rating in Canada. And we're going to continue to be fiscally responsible, but we're also going to recognize other kinds of deficits. And when we have the opportunity to address those deficits, we're going to do it.
Well, Mr. Premier, thank you for your time tonight. I know that we've covered a lot of territory, and I really appreciate you digging into it, and look forward to see what happens in the rest of your term before you go to the polls. So thank you ever so much, and hopefully by sharing these thoughts tonight, you're going to have a better sleep tonight.
Yeah, that's, thanks very much for having me, sir. Thanks, Vaughn. Thanks for your questions. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you to all of you who are here in the room. We will be back because talking about where is our economy going, our next panel in May is going to be looking at life sciences and biomedical technology. Is it BC's innovative future? That will be in mid-May. I want to thank our sponsors, most definitely, Helijet in particular for being our presenting sponsor tonight, but also for all of our event sponsors, Stem Cell, Fortis BC, Landlord BC, BD, Polygon, the Port of Vancouver, and the Digital Supercluster, along with Research Co. and our media partner, the Vancouver Sun. Thank you for giving so much of yourself tonight. Thank you.